The work I'll be presenting today is part of a 2-year project that was funded by Peer. And the goal of the project was to look at the Los Angeles Bridge Network and assess the risk to that network using the new generation of Caltrans fragility curves that Greg mentioned earlier. And this was in collaboration with our colleagues at McGill. So we were looking at performance in terms of functional recovery, we meaning us at UCLA, and the McGill folks were looking at in terms of repair costs. Last year at the peer workshop, I presented on sort of a bridge-specific methodology for evaluating functional recovery for individual bridges. So today I'm going to talk about scaling that up to look at the entire bridge network. So quick acknowledgement of the team. So as I mentioned before, this is in collaboration with our colleagues at McGill, Yajo Xie and his PhD student, and then Chen Hao Wu. And then we also are partnering with several others, including Jamie Paget, who was heavily involved in developing those next-gen fragility curves, and then folks at the Sim Center and others. So before getting into the functional recovery, I thought I'd talk about sort of at its core, this work is part of moving us towards or advancing the way we characterize vulnerability for regional risk assessment. So as Greg mentioned, sort of in earlier works, we would typically use the hazardous fragility curves that are defined at the system level. They have a fairly low resolution and limited consideration of uncertainty. The second generation fragility curves, which is really our focus, are so these are component level fragility curves. So you have fragility curves for the various components that govern the response and also damage to the bridge, and then there's enhanced consideration of uncertainty. And then there's also the third generation, which I would say is more sort of geared towards the types of things that Greg was talking about, where we're using either explicit response simulation or surrogate models. So the work we're doing is mostly focused on that second generation, where we're using these component level fragilities. But as you'll see later, we are, particularly in the functional recovery method we did develop with an eye towards the third generation. So the workflow for the regional assessment of functional recovery has to start with seismic hazard characterization. And the two things that I want to mention there is that we're doing this characterization and assessment looking at a single scenario, and then we're also doing a stochastic event set-based assessment. We spent a lot of time trying to gather information about the actual inventory. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we are using these second generation or next generation component level fragility curves for the damage assessment. And again, the key here is that these fragility curves allow us to simulate damage at the component level. And then we're doing this high resolution functional recovery, and just high resolution just means we're doing it even though we're doing this on a regional scale. When we're doing the functional recovery assessment, we're doing it for the individual bridges, and then we aggregate that information to get some network scale performance. So as I mentioned before, for the hazard, we looked at both a single scenario as well as the stochastic event set. So for the single scenario, we started by doing a hazard deaggregation at the centroid of the city of LA. And based on the results of that deaggregation, we selected a single representative scenario from the USURF3 model. So for the stochastic event set hazard characterization, so this is where you want to consider sort of the full suite of events that can affect the region. This is for LA on the order of hundreds of thousands. We don't want to have to run through all of those. So we use what's called an event subset selection methodology. So the idea here is you use a subset of the events, but you do it with the goal of replicating the results you would get if you use the full set. And there are different methods out there that are available to do this. We went with the friends and family method, meaning we went with a model developed by my colleagues Scott Brandenburg and Jonathan Stord and others. And so, you know, Scott challenged me to explain this in 20 seconds or less. There's a paper here if you're interested in the details. But basically what they're doing, which I thought is a clever idea, you're trying to predict the Y here is basically the hazard curve associated with all the sites. And then you're doing that as a function of the rates of the different rupture scenarios. And they're using lasso. And so what lasso does is it does a shrinkage of the shrinkage of the coefficients such that you remove some of the scenarios if the coefficients shrink to zero, and so that gets you your subset of events that you want to work with. So what I'm showing here is just what we're trying to do with this subset is be able to match the hazard curves at all the different sites that we're considering. Here we looked at, we ended up using 400 ground motion maps from 30 rupture scenarios, and we're showing a range of matches here from the best to the median, as well as the 96th percentile error. Okay, so one of the things we had to spend a lot of time on, and this is where we had it was helpful having a collaboration with our colleagues at McGill, is capturing the inventory. So we did this assessment by coming up with a set of bridge classes, and these again are similar to the classes or groupings that are used by HAZUS based on different parameters like the design era, the number of spans, the bend type, the abutment type. And so what we needed to do is take the individual bridges from the inventory and place it in these various classes based on these various parameters. And so we had to get information both at the system level as well as the component level. The component level information is needed for the damage assessment, but also for the functional recovery. And so we use a number of different sources. A lot of them have been mentioned earlier, things like the National Bridge Inventory and the National Bridge Element. Okay, so just a little bit about the inventory. So about 70% of the bridges are in era 1. So these are pre-1970 bridges, and then 20% era 2, 10% era 3. And then when you look inside of the different eras, you can see sort of some of the other characteristics that the fragilities are based on. So for example, you can look at the distribution of diaphragm versus seat type bridges. You can look at distributions in terms of the number of spans, and also the type of bend. So you have, if it's a single span bridge, there's no bend, and then there are bends that are made of columns, and then there are also bridges that are sitting on pier walls. And so a big part of this effort was going through a lot of the research that was funded by Caltrans. Greg mentioned Reggie DeRoche and Jamie Padgett did a lot of that work. So we went through the literature and assembled a lot of those component level fragility curves. There's a data paper that has the details of those fragilities that's making its way through earthquake spectra. And basically you can look at a particular, here we're looking at an era 1 bridge with 2 spans, 1 column bent, and a diaphragm type bridge, and you get your component fragility information. Okay, so now I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the functional recovery methodology. I'm gonna go through it very quickly. If you're interested in the details, there's a Spectra paper that's in press right now that has all of the details. So the framework, you can think of it as in 2 parts. The first part is the hazard and damage analysis. That's sort of the typical performance-based earthquake engineering strategy. And then in the Bronx, that's where we had to spend a lot of time thinking about how to take this damage information and get something that tells us something about functionality and the time it takes to recover and things like that. So we had to spend time thinking about how you go from physical damage to different components, how do those things affect the functionality state, thinking about the impeding factors. So these are activities that need to be carried out before you can even start the repairs. The repair activities themselves, and both for the repair and the impeding factors, we had to think about not just what had to be done, but the sequencing of these activities, and then ultimately coming up with the recovery time. So I mentioned before that even though the project is sort of sitting in the middle in that using those 2nd generation fragility curves, we developed this framework with the third generation sort of vulnerability assessment in mind, meaning we have the method can accommodate doing what we call IM-based assessment. So this would be if you have the component level fragility curves that are conditioned on the shaking intensity, and it would give you the damage. That would be the IM-based approach. And then also the EDP-based approach, where you would go through and build a structural model, do detailed nonlinear response history analyses. You have a demand model from that. You also have a capacity model, and you can simulate damage. Okay, so we're trying to model functional recovery. So one of the things we have to do is define what we mean by functionality states. And basically, these states are based on different types of disruptions that can happen once a bridge is damaged. So for example, you can have either partial or complete lane closure, or you can have some type of weight limit restriction placed. And so based on those things, we came up with this set of functionality states. We distinguish between functionality states that are only relevant to the reopening phase, because some things actually, we found in discussions with Caltrans and others that some things happen primarily as you're sort of reopening the bridge, where some types of restrictions, where there are other restrictions are placed during the immediate response or reopening, right? So we have these 7 functionality states that range from full functionality to complete closure, and then with some type of partial closure in the middle. I mentioned before we're considering these impeding factors. Again, these are factors these are activities that need to be done before the repairs start. So things like doing visual or in-depth inspection, getting financing, permitting, and things like that. And not only do we have to consider those factors, but we also have to consider the way they're sequenced. So we spent a lot of time with folks from Caltrans. Shout out to Sharon Yen if she's here for connecting us, thinking about sort of the process, what actually happens after an earthquake. So for example, you would do a visual inspection and you would determine whether an in-depth inspection is needed. So that means, is the damage or lack thereof obvious to the extent where, okay, you're pretty certain on what the state of the bridge is, or you may have to call for a more in-depth inspection. And then based on that, you can finalize your closure decision. We also took into account the possibility of an emergency protocol. So it's often the case that if a bridge is damaged, depending on the importance of the bridge, the extent of damage, that there would be a state-level emergency protocol triggered that would sort of fast-track certain activities. So for example, in the case of the impeding factors, if there's an emergency protocol, then the selection of the contractor would happen while the design is happening, and sometimes the contractor would participate in the design. Whereas if there's not, then there's a different sequencing, so the contractor would be selected after the design and things like that. I mentioned before, so we have to think about the sequencing of the impeding factors, but we also need to think about the sequencing of the component repairs. So this is one example of a sequence shown here. So the row on the top is for the bent foundation and superstructure. The row on the bottom is related to things related to the abutment, so the foundations and the superstructure part of the abutment. And then there's also some interaction between those two layers. The model also can incorporate constraints related to worker allocation, so both in terms of the number of workers per crew and as well as the number of crews and how they're assigned to do repairs of different components. And that's just trying to be as realistic as possible in terms of how these activities are carried out in a real earthquake. Okay, so before I show some results, I wanted to sort of put in our minds some things to think about as we look at these functional recovery assessment results. So for example, so this figure is based on a white paper that was put out by ERI on a conceptual framework for functional recovery with options. So they talk about different aspects of functional recovery, like definitional, meaning what has to be done to achieve functional recovery, the policy side, what is acceptable, there's the implementation side, so how would this actually be implemented in practice, and then also what strategies that can be used to enhance functional recovery. And that one is probably the one I'll focus mostly on, meaning, are you going to do retrofits, are you going to replace bridges, are you going to enhance the resource allocation after the earthquake to actually to help with the recovery. So some results from this single scenario assessment. So what's shown here in this map is the median functional recovery time for the various bridges. So a couple things to point out. So most of the bridges that have what we would call severe functional disruption, these are the Era 1 multi-span bridges, no surprise there. And then among all the components, the damage to the bridge bent, this could be either the columns or the pier walls, depending on the type of bridge, is the most frequent functional disruptor. The last point there, where it says almost 50% of the bridges in the network are damaged beyond repair, I have an asterisk there because, is this realistic? These results are fairly new, so we still have to spend some time looking at, past earthquakes to see how realistic these results are, particularly in terms of the damage. For the stochastic event set based results, so one of the types of results we can get is for a particular performance target. So in this case, that's the horizontal axis, which is the time for 90% of bridges to be restored to full functionality. The vertical axis is the annual rate of exceedance. Again, that's considering the full spectrum of events that can happen. It's hard to make sense of this curve by itself, but what you can do is you can use it to set a risk-based performance target. So for example, you might want to maximize the probability of that the time to full recovery for 90% of the bridges, say, does not exceed 6 months, right? So for this particular assessment, that turns out to be a probability of about 55%. And you can also disaggregate the contribution of the repairs from repairs versus impeding factors. We also looked at the effect of different performance enhancement strategies. So for example, we looked at retrofitting all the Era 1 columns using FRP jacketing. We also looked at doubling the workforce, extending the work hours, and less so. We were less focused at this point, at least, on the absolute result, but the type of change that each one was bringing about. So for example, here, the baseline is in black and the retrofit one is in blue. And you can see here the vertical axis is the fraction of fully recovered bridge. So this is not as bad as it thinks. You see that a drop to 20% there. That doesn't necessarily mean there's the drop in functionality is 20%. That's a fraction of bridges that are fully functional, right? So a lot of those might be partially functional, right? So we see that the retrofit doesn't do a lot to reduce that initial drop, but it does sort of help. After about 75 days, you get some enhancement in the recovery trajectory, and then looking at the workforce and the extended work hours, those also have a significant impact on that recovery trajectory. We can also look at the effect of these enhancements based on using the stochastic event set based regional performance. And again, we have the exceedance curve, the exceedance curve shown there on the right, but it's more informative to look at this performance target that we established. Again, this is the probability that 90% of our bridges are restored to full functionality within 6 months or so. So the baseline probability was 55%. The retrofit increases that to 60%. And again, you can see the numbers for the increased workforce and the increased work hours. Again, the focus is less so on the absolute value or the relative impact of the retrofit versus the workforce, increased workforce or work hours, because the doubling is sort of arbitrary. It was more so to get a sense for how these different types of enhancements can affect the overall performance. Okay, so to wrap up with summary and next steps. So again, at a high level, the goal of this project is to try to enhance these regional risk and resilience assessments using component level fragilities that give a much richer information set that can be used to guide decision making. We're assessing risk and resilience both in terms of functional recovery, as I presented here, as well as repair costs, and that's based on work that's ongoing by our collaborators at McGill. We're currently doing some work to incorporate the functional recovery methodology and the component level fragilities into the SimCenter tools so that others can take advantage of them. And ultimately, what we're trying to do here is to enable a more precise estimation of cost and benefits associated with different types of enhancement strategies, right? So I showed a few different types of enhancements there. I didn't really talk about, sort of the cost associated with any of them. So that's something that you'd want to think about in the future as you make decisions about how to enhance the resilience of the network.